Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hi, I'm James Crossley. I'm the owner of Leviathan Bookstore in St. Louis, Missouri, and I was a bookseller member of the panel that selected the books chosen for the Indies Introduced program this fall, and I'm here with one of those authors. David Greig is a Scottish writer whose plays have been performed widely in the UK and around the world. His theater work includes The Strange Undoing of Prudencia Hart, Touching the Void, Midsummer, The Events, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Local Hero, and Dunsinane. From 2015 to 2025, he was the artistic director at Edinburgh's Lyceum Theatre. The Book of I is his first novel. That book was one of the first that I read when we were going through the submissions, and no slight to the many other wonderful books that we chose, but that was also one of the first that I knew was going to be on the list. So David, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here, and it's a thrill. I'm speaking from Scotland, and when one writes a novel, particularly one's first, quite late in life in a way, maybe compared to other people, I didn't really expect it to go anywhere particularly. Like, I'm not an idiot, I know that most novels, you're really lucky if you sell a few hundred in your local community. So to know that it's reached America is just so joyful. So thank you for having me, and thank you for this chance to talk about it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So your story is set on the island of Iona, which is sometimes known by its initial letter, hence the title of the book, in the 9th century. Can you tell us about what that place was like then, how the book grew out of that landscape?
Yeah, so Iona is an island off an island. It's a small, very beautiful island off the bigger island of Mull, which is off the west coast of Scotland. In the 9th century, that was part of a kind of pan-Irish Scottish kingdom called Dalriada. And it was an early Christian kingdom. In fact, one of the things that people don't really know is that Christianity kind of, when it came to Britain, it kind of came from Ireland and the west coast of Scotland, which was where the church fathers who founded Christianity in Britain, they're sometimes called the Celtic Church, they came from there. And one of the most important of those figures was a man called Columba, Saint Columba. And he was already a very famous sort of religious writer and figure. I should probably say that monks and monasteries were a really big part of this culture, and they were like incredible recorders of history and makers of books and makers of peace treaties. They were really important figures. And actually, in some ways, they were the most sophisticated thing that Britain had seen, or these islands had seen, since the Romans had departed. Anyway, so Columba, later in his life, founded a monastery, an abbey, on the island of Iona. And that monastery became really the capital of Christian culture in the west of Scotland. And a few hundred years passed. I think it was 500 that he founded it, but our story is 825, so about 300 years have gone by. And the issue now is that the Vikings have started to raid all around the British coast, and particularly the monasteries. They really love monasteries because monasteries have all kinds of things that you can attack, and monks in general don't fight back. And so they've already raided Iona a couple of times, to the extent that the kings of Dalriada have suggested that really the monastery should be moved into the middle of Ireland, away from where the Vikings go. But one abbot, he this is all true, by the way. Sorry, I should say this is all true. One abbot really wants to be a martyr. He believes, I mean, it's a different sort of Christianity than we're used to, but he wants to die for God. And so he says, no, 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 we should go, and we will rebuild and keep Iona going. And so he, for 25 years, runs the community of monks on this island, but sort of knows that any day, death could come in the form of a raid. And during this period, what they do is make books. And one of the books they make, and this is the name for the title of the book, they make this book, which ultimately becomes what we know as the Book of Kells. Is that familiar to you? I don't know if people in America know about this. It's very, very famous.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, it's a really, famous medieval manuscript. It's the first four Gospels, and it's beautifully illustrated. Beautifully illustrated. Now, Kells is a monastery in the middle of Ireland, but actually, what has been discovered by recent scholarship is, in all likelihood, the bulk of the book was made on Iona during this period. So during this period, when the monks are kind of both waiting for this terrible death that they sort of know is almost certainly coming, they are also making this beautiful book, this illustrated Bible. And anyway, one day in 825, there was a Viking raid, and all the monks were killed, and that is the true story. So all of that is true. What I've done is I've then imagined from that what would happen if one of the Vikings was accidentally left behind by his gang, and if also by a miracle one of the monks survived, and there is another couple of people who then turn up in the book as well, but it becomes a story of how these people find a way to survive, get along, to pass the summer on the island whilst they wait for what's called the autumn raiding season, when they sort of know the Vikings will come back to finish the job. So it's a kind of that's the story of it, really, and that's the background.
Yeah, almost like the very contemporary futuristic novel, The Martian, right? But the one man is left and has to make his way.
Well, actually, do you know, I mean, I hope I don't give too much away, but I slightly based it on, or I was quite inspired by the film Witness with Harrison Ford amongst the Amish. I was really interested in this idea of a gangster amongst peacemakers, which is really what Witness is, and I find that really fascinating. And I suppose I became interested in Celtic Christianity because it was very revolutionary at the time in ways that we maybe slightly forget, because really, this was a world of utter warlordism. I mean, really a very, very violent world. And it was pagan, and that paganness, the Viking paganness, but also the Anglo-Saxon paganness and all of that, was sort of predicated on the idea that it was good to be strong and kill people, and if gods were with you, that's what would happen, and if the god wasn't with you, you'd be weak. So this idea of a religion that was founded on the idea that you might want to be weak, or you might want to be humble, or these sorts of things, was completely insane to these people. I mean, they looked at it and just went, "You're mad. What are you talking about?" And I thought that would be quite an interesting, funny place to begin, to sort of have this encounter, and also the availability of a love story, because the third character is the woman who makes the mead, MEAD, the mead, the drink, the beer, the honey beer that fed the monks. And she's very, very good at it. And she is left. She survives the raid as well. And so she's our sort of, that also becomes a story, the story of the Viking, the monk, and her together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting that weakness that you talked about, like the abbot, the monk in charge of the whole thing, who basically is offering himself as a sacrifice, but in so doing, also squandering the lives of all the people who are under him who wouldn't necessarily have made that choice. So it's both
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh, I'm just the Lamb of God, but
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think what interested me about it in a way is I wanted to make Christianity strange in order to possibly then make it re-interesting again. I think we're so, I don't know, America, obviously you have a different relationship with religion, much more. I think it's much more present in daily life than it is in Britain. We're a much more secular country, and I think I wanted to make Christianity seem very odd. And some of the assumptions that we make, and one of those assumptions is, for example, that it's not a good thing generally to be massacred, and and yet I wanted to remind people that there was this moment where some people certainly felt that to be sacrificed in the name of God was really one of the best possible things that could happen to you.
Well, that is a very weighty subject, but the
Yeah.
book does not read that way. You're dealing with war, you're dealing with religion, you're dealing with all these issues, but it's a very funny book.
Thank you. Yeah,
And
yeah.
in my opinion, there are not, well, first of all, there are not nearly enough comic novels in general, and
Mm.
few of those comic novels that there are make it onto awards lists if the Indies Introduced program is sort of an award.
Yeah,
Did
yeah.
you set out to make the book funny, or is that just how the story came out as you wrote it?
A little bit of both. In my theatre work, I always have a lot of humour. Um, very few of my plays don't have any jokes. A lot of them have jokes, and I think it's just the way I write. It's just if I think things are funny, I just think they're funny, and there's not much I can sort of do about it. And so any subject I tackle tends to get. So I suppose what it means I don't go looking for the funny. It's just when I tackle a subject, I will start to uncover things that make me laugh, and I want to explore in that way. So it was a sort of natural outgrowth of the writing. But I also did begin. I thought it was funny at the very very beginning some of the discussions that happen between the young monk Martin, who survives by basically climbing into the lavatory pit and literally sitting in the shit while everyone else is killed. And he's deeply ashamed of this. I mean, he really thinks, he just basically got scared. He was young, and he survives because he's a coward, and so he's terribly ashamed of this, and he wants to make it up to God by rebuilding the monastery single-handed, which is of course a ludicrous task. But I thought his discussions with my guy, Grymer the Viking, could be really funny because both sides would be so strange to each other, and it just sort of made me laugh to think of what they might how would they speak to each other? How would they help each other when their worldviews were so different? Um, but also, I think the other thing I should say is I'm quite, as I said, I'm writing this. I'm in my 50s. I'm not the usual age for a debut novelist, and I always get annoyed when I read books that action heroes. Or even films, like they're never tired. Do you know? They're never sort of just old blokes. And I just thought it would be funny because Vikings, that's a hard life being a Viking. There's a lot of rowing and a lot of, fighting. Fighting's hard. And I can bet at the moment, I used to be quite fit, but when I go running, I'm just like, I'm out of breath. And all the young guys are up ahead of me in the club. So I thought it would be funny to have him jumping off the boat with his sword and everything. And then like the other young Vikings are running off, and he's like, oh dear me, I can't keep up with these young men huffing and puffing. And he's like wondering, is he going to be out of breath? And when he gets there, is he going to have to do some really hard fighting? And I just like the idea of a slightly sort of grumpy, tired old man being a
Yeah,
Viking.
they struck me almost like a team of professional athletes. This is what we do.
Yeah,
We got to gear up for
exactly.
the game, go
Yeah,
in, beat the other team, get out again, and yeah,
yeah.
he's close
I
to
love.
retirement.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one of the things I love about the novel form, is that it's like you can borrow from movies, but sort of get under the skin, if that makes sense. So I love, old gangster is at end of life type stories, or a, or what the sort of genre of a summer away from everything in which everything changes, or these sorts of genres. And I think I wanted to play with that, but at the same time have the pleasure of being able to get inside the characters' heads and the sort of dumb assumptions that they have. And poor old Martin falls in love with this girl who arrives on the island at another point, and he's just a silly teenage boy, really, in love. And but mixing that with his very, very serious study of the Bible is also was also funny for me. So I just kept looking for these funny bits, really.
Mhm. Well, the language that you used in the book was wonderful. I mean, occasionally lyrical, often earthy, in a wonderful combination in the dialogue, in the description. The vocabulary felt like it was drawn from that period, the Gaelic, Norse,
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, what have you. Uh, how did you achieve that effect? Did you research it? Did you just, again, did it read other
Yeah.
books from that period?
There's a few different things. I mean, I never directly research as such. Usually what happens is there comes a point in my where I go, oh yeah, all those books I've been reading, that's a novel. And that it was a bit like that with this. I was very, very interested in medieval Scotland. Just anyway. And so I was reading all kinds of things. I was reading medieval histories. I was reading Gaelic translations of Gaelic, early Gaelic hymns, poetry, all kinds of stuff like that. So I was quite familiar with that language. I was becoming very interested in Viking and Norse stuff and reading all about that. And I discovered this fantastic thing called kennings. So a kenning is a poetry form that the Norse used, which is really quite elaborate metaphors, sort of metaphors with two steps in them. So, for example, the easiest one would be if I said I'm setting out on the Whale Road. The Whale Road is the sea. You could say one of the strangest ones is the gold on the branch. Was it the gold on the branches or something? Which is it means like a ring, but the ring is on a woman's arm. So it's like the gold on the tree or something means a beautiful woman has come in, or a rich woman. So and there's a few there's basically lists of about 1,000 of these kennings, these phrases that get used that a Viking would know, but they're sort of deliberately odd and strange. And so that was a real treat for me, because I just thought, well, whenever I'm stuck, I'll use one of them, because it'll just make things interesting, and because it's just such an odd way to see the world. So I used quite a few kennings. I didn't want to. Do you know the films Lord of the Rings and all of that stuff? I really don't like there's there's a type of thing that happens, and you'll have these characters and they'll say, there's one in Lord of the Rings I always remember, is like, long have I yearned to see the towers of Minas Tirith. And I always think that's just nonsense. Nobody speaks like that. Nobody speaks like that. They don't speak like that
Right.
now, but they didn't speak like that then. If in the sense is, even if they did say long have I yearned to see the towers of Minas Tirith, it's because that was a normal way of talking. They're not people in the old days didn't talk anymore. They didn't talk
Yeah.
weird.
It's
They
not
just talk,
portentous. It's not,
yeah,
yeah. And the
yeah.
first thing they would have said is, holy crap.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, the one with that, I always think, is they should say, "Oh God, I'm really knackered. I just fought a big battle, and now do we have to climb that? Oh no, So I think that's also, maybe that's actually where the humor comes from. I think pricking pomposity, whether it's the pomposity of how we view Vikings or the pomposity of how we view early Christians, that's probably where the comedy comes from. I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm realizing. That was one of my favorite things about the book, is that it felt lived in, it felt naturalistic, even though it was
Yeah.
foreign, obviously different ways of life,
Yeah.
different mindsets, but those were people doing the best they could,
Yeah.
as happy as they could in the
I mean,
environment in which they lived.
I always think about the past, because I've written plays set in the past as well. I think the key thing is, like, one thing that I absolutely know about a Viking like Grima, I absolutely know that he was a human, and because he was a human, he felt the wind on his skin. He felt thirst. He had emotions. He felt love or desire, and all of these things. And I know that, so I know he was like me. But I also know that he was utterly strange to me, and had thought and did things that I could never understand. And I think that tension is really interesting for a writer, where what you try to find is you try to find the ways where they're like you, but you also try to remember where they're really different from you, and that tension is quite fun to write into, I think.
Yeah. Well, we've mentioned more than once that this is your first novel, and
Yeah,
that you also have an established career as a playwright.
yeah.
I saw something where you once said that you were jealous of people who'd written a proper book. And so what made you decide to put yourself in that group?
Well, I mean, the first thing is it's absolutely true. I always used to think playwrights. I still think playwrights aren't really writers. I think we're hacks. We're terrible old hacks. We're craftspeople, really. But the proper a book. This is proper. Like, you've done a book. And the truth is, my mum. A lot of this comes from my mum, who basically Scottish people don't really like theatre. Theatre's an Irish. The Irish people, they know about theatre and plays, and the English, London, they do. But Scotland, basically, because we had a Protestant revolution that was pretty close to the Taliban under John Knox, we just banned theatre for 400 years. We didn't have theatre, we didn't have music, any of that stuff. So theatre in Scotland is a little bit of a suspect tradition, a little bit like you run a brothel or something, whereas the book, yes, well, that is proper, because at the very least it's written in, language. It's a book, you can hold it. It's work if you've done a book. So all my life I had wanted to do a book, but every time I sat down to do it, I would write just the most awful rubbish, because I would be trying to be clever and important, and I would sort of write books that began, I would sit and say, oh, I should write my book today, and I would sit down and the sentence would be, David Important stood and looked out of the window at the terrible world and wondered where it had all gone wrong, and it was just, oh God, it was so boring. So I never really did. And then I gave up until the editor of a series in Scotland here called Darklands, where a really clever idea, the publisher here, Jamie Crawford is the editor. He said he wanted to write he wanted to commission a series of thrillers, short thrillers, novellas set in the past in some part of Scottish history, by authors who had some audience, and sell them to a public, partly a Scottish public, but also with the awareness that there are people who travel to Scotland every year and might want to know about Mary Queen of Scots, or they might want to know about Bonnie Prince Charlie. So he'd done a few of those. They were very, very good, and I admired them and the writers who did them. And he then came to me. I don't know how he got hold of my sort of, I mean, I'm a playwright, but anyway, someone had maybe said to him that I liked history. And so he said, would you be interested in writing a short thriller set in the past of Scottish history? And that was this huge door opening for me, because suddenly I was slightly back to being a hack again, if that makes sense. I was not sitting down to write the great Scottish novel and then failing because it was so stupid. In fact, I was now sitting down to write an exciting story set in the past, both of which I liked. So it was sort of odd. For the first time, I was writing something that I might actually want to read, and that had never occurred to me. That would be something that you could do. I thought novels had to be slightly, boring and difficult.
Just good for you.
Yeah.
Not entertaining, not fun, but just important. That
I
is
don't know.
one of the best pieces of advice I've heard from more than one writing. It's, write the book you want to read.
Yeah, but it's
So
incredibly hard, isn't it? Because we are terribly, as people, we're so interested in what people think of us, and we have illusions of ourselves, and we want to live up to those illusions, and so you're terribly disappointed when you realize that you're basically a comic novelist, and you're not going to ever be the Dostoevsky that you wish to be. But it's also a great liberation when that finally happens. I should say I've always loved the story. I don't know if you know the story about Martin Amis and his father Kingsley. Martin, obviously the great novelist of the 80s and 90s, and Kingsley, a British comic novelist in the 50s. And Martin Amis was always very upset that Kingsley didn't read his books, Martin's books. And one day, he sort of challenged his father on this, and his father said, "Oh God, Martin, you know me. I can only read a book if it begins, a shot rang out." And clearly, Martin's big pretentious tomes didn't have that. But I always loved that story because I'm a bit like that myself. I kind of like, yeah, I would love to begin with a shot rang out. And in a way, with the Book of I, that's as close as I can get for a Viking story to beginning a shot rang out. It begins where you get catapulted head first into the raid.
Well, this pot boiler has, accidentally included a good deal to say about the human condition and other important things in
Yeah,
life. Well, it's also
but
very fun. So,
isn't that also, yeah, I mean, but I'm so happy you say that. And I really think that. But I genuinely believe that it's one of the great mysteries of life that if I'd sat down to say, David, what do you think about, the human condition? I would have written rubbish. But because I sat down to say, let's do an exciting story in which a Viking basically has to survive for the summer in hostile territory, it's like oddly then out of that comes things, and I didn't mean to do it, but I really am pleased you noticed that, because I do think I don't think it is well, I don't even know if I I do think there is more to the book than in fact, I'm not very good at writing thrillers. The truth is, part of the reason the whole thing works is because I couldn't really do a thriller. I just think it's funny. I just keep thinking it's too funny. So I think there's that as well, that it's the attempt to do something that I can't really do actually helped me in a strange way.
well, I think people are really going to enjoy it. And I am looking
Thank
forward
you.
to introducing it to people. And I
Thank
hope
you.
that Indies Introduced program introduces it to a lot more people.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
it's been wonderful to talk to you. Thanks for being here.
Could I just briefly say,
Oh, yeah.
to you and the people listening, who I believe many of whom may be booksellers, and particularly indie booksellers, I just think you are the noblest people on earth. I grew up going to independent bookshops at a time when every town had an independent bookshop, and there was no great chains, and there was no mighty and internet dominating everything. And so now when I find an independent bookshop, the curation, the care, the love of the book, all of these things in a world that seems to be shedding all of that, I love it. And so the idea that you independent booksellers have picked my book means a great, great deal to me. And it candidly means much more to me than had it been some sort of, algorithmical win on the great lottery of Bezos. So thank you very, very much for having me and for picking the book. I'm really thrilled about it.
Long have we yearned to hear that from you.
That's really good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!